Welcome back to English Listening Practice. I'm Emma, and I'm really excited about this week because we're doing something a little different. Instead of just one voice, you're going to hear two of us having a real conversation.
That's right. I'm James, and I've been looking forward to this all week. Emma and I have known each other for years, and we have very different perspectives on a lot of things, which I think is going to make for some really interesting discussion.
Absolutely. And for anyone who's listening for the first time, this is a B2 level English listening program. So we speak at a natural pace, we use natural vocabulary, and we just have honest conversations about things that matter. Today we're covering a lot of ground: identity, relationships, culture, work, technology, mental health, and more.
We've got a lot to get through, so let's just dive in. Emma, I want to start with something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, which is identity. Who we are. How we see ourselves. Because I think a lot of people, myself included, spend a surprising amount of time not really knowing who they are.
That's such a rich place to start. And I think you're right. Most of us have a version of ourselves that we present to the world: the professional version, the social version, the version we are with our family, and sometimes those versions feel so different from each other that it's hard to know which one is the real you.
Exactly. And psychologists actually have a term for this. They call it the social self versus the private self. The social self is who we are in public, shaped by what other people expect and what we think is acceptable. The private self is who we are when no one is watching. And the interesting thing is that both of those are real. They're both genuinely you. But they can feel very different.
I think one of the hardest things about identity is that it changes. I am genuinely not the same person I was 10 years ago. My values have shifted, my priorities are different, my sense of what matters has changed considerably. And that can feel disorienting, because we have this idea that there should be one consistent self underneath all the change.
That idea comes from a very Western, individualistic model of the self, though. If you look at Eastern philosophical traditions, particularly Buddhist philosophy, the concept of a fixed, permanent self is actually considered an illusion. The idea is that the self is more like a river than a rock. It's constantly flowing, constantly changing, and that's not something to resist. It's just the nature of existence.
That's a perspective I found really helpful, actually. Because when you stop trying to maintain a consistent identity and start thinking of yourself as an ongoing process, something that's always developing, it takes a lot of pressure off. You don't have to be the same person you were 5 years ago. Growth often involves becoming someone quite different.
Though I think there's a counter-argument, which is that some continuity of self is important for psychological stability. If everything about you is constantly shifting, if your values today are completely different from your values last year, there's something unsettling about that. I think what we want is a kind of flexible consistency, a core set of values that remains relatively stable, while allowing the expression of those values to evolve as we do.
That's a great way to put it. A core that's stable but a surface that can shift. And I think for a lot of people, especially in their 20s and 30s, a big part of life is figuring out what that core actually is. What do you genuinely believe? What actually matters to you, as opposed to what you've been told should matter?
And that process is uncomfortable. I've heard it called individuation, the process of becoming your own person, separate from the expectations of your family, your culture, your social group. It often involves a period of real uncertainty, where you're questioning things you used to take for granted, and you haven't yet found solid ground again.
I went through something like that in my mid-20s. I had a career that looked great from the outside and felt hollow from the inside. And the process of being honest about that, and slowly finding something that felt more genuinely mine, was difficult. But looking back, I think it was one of the most important things I've ever done.
I had a similar experience. And I think one thing that helps is understanding that you don't find yourself, you build yourself. Your identity is not something hidden inside you waiting to be discovered. It's something you construct through your choices, your actions, your relationships, and your experiences over time.
I love that framing. Because it's actually quite empowering. You're not stuck with a predetermined self. You're the author of who you become.
Well, within limits. We don't get to choose our starting point, our genetics, our early experiences, the culture we're born into. These things shape us profoundly and in ways we often don't recognize. But we do have more agency over who we become than we sometimes give ourselves credit for.
That's true. And on the topic of things that shape us without us realizing, can we talk about culture? Because I think culture is one of the most powerful forces in anyone's life, and it's also one of the most invisible.
Absolutely. Because when something is everywhere, it becomes the water you swim in. You don't notice it. Your culture defines what's normal, what's polite, what's ambitious, what's acceptable, what's embarrassing. And until you step outside of it, by traveling, by meeting people from very different backgrounds, by reading widely, you often can't see it at all.
I grew up in the United States, and one of the things that surprised me when I spent time living in Europe was how differently people relate to work. In the US, there's a strong cultural story that says hard work is the highest virtue, that your career is your identity, and that being busy is a status symbol. And I had absorbed that story completely without realizing it.
In the UK, we have some of that too, but there's also more of a tradition of skepticism about people who are too visibly ambitious. There's a cultural tendency to understate things, to be modest, to not take yourself too seriously. Which has its own problems. It can make it harder to advocate for yourself or to take credit for things you've actually achieved.
Every culture has its shadow side. The American hustle culture produces a lot of innovation and dynamism, but also a lot of burnout, anxiety, and people who've sacrificed their health and relationships in pursuit of professional success. The British understatement culture produces a kind of social ease and self-deprecating humor that I genuinely love, but it can also mean that important things go unsaid.
And when you're aware of these patterns, when you can actually see the cultural water you're swimming in, you get to make a choice about which aspects to embrace and which to question. That's one of the most valuable things travel and cross-cultural experience can give you.
Which connects back to identity, actually. Because part of building yourself is deciding which parts of your cultural inheritance you want to carry forward and which parts you want to leave behind. That's not disloyalty to where you came from. It's just conscious living.
Beautifully put. Okay, let's move on to something that I know both of us have strong feelings about: relationships. Because whether it's friendships, romantic partnerships, family, or professional connections, relationships are probably the most significant factor in whether people feel their lives are going well.
Without question. And the research on this is remarkably consistent. The Harvard Study of Adult Development, one of the longest-running studies of human well-being ever conducted, followed hundreds of people for over 80 years and found that the single strongest predictor of a long, healthy, happy life was not wealth, not professional success, not fame, but the quality of people's close relationships.
That's striking. And yet it's also something that most of us instinctively know but often behave as though we've forgotten. We prioritize work over connection. We let friendships lapse because we're busy. We take our closest relationships for granted because they're always there.
I think part of what happens is that we overestimate how much we'll enjoy things that feel urgent, finishing a project, achieving a goal, buying something we've wanted, and underestimate how much sustained happiness comes from things that feel slow and unglamorous, like a long conversation with a close friend, or a quiet evening with someone we love.
Psychologists call this the hedonic treadmill, the tendency to adapt quickly to positive events and return to our baseline level of happiness. You get the promotion, you're thrilled for a few weeks, and then the new normal sets in. But the same adaptation happens more slowly, if at all, with deep relationships. The research suggests that close relationships provide a more sustained source of well-being than almost anything else.
So what makes relationships actually work? Because I think there's a lot of mythology around this. We talk about chemistry and compatibility and finding the right person, as though a good relationship is primarily a matter of luck, of meeting the right person at the right time.
And there's something to that. But the research, particularly John Gottman's decades of work on couples, suggests that what determines whether a relationship thrives is less about compatibility and more about how people handle conflict, how they respond to each other's needs for attention and connection, and whether there's a ratio of positive to negative interactions that remains strongly in favor of the positive.
Gottman found that in stable, happy relationships, there are roughly 5 positive interactions for every 1 negative one. Not because happy couples never disagree or never have difficult conversations, but because the general tone of the relationship is warm, engaged, and supportive enough that individual moments of tension don't erode the foundation.
And one of the most important findings from his research is that it's not the big dramatic moments that make or break relationships. It's the small, ordinary moments. The way you greet someone when they come home. Whether you put down your phone when they're talking to you. Whether you notice when they seem stressed and ask how they're doing. These tiny moments of connection or disconnection, repeated thousands of times over years, are what determine the health of a relationship.
That's both hopeful and humbling. Hopeful because it means the bar for being a good partner or friend is not about grand gestures. It's about consistent attention. But humbling because consistent attention is actually quite hard in a distracted world where our phones are always competing for our focus.
And I think that's where the culture of constant connectivity has actually harmed our closest relationships. When you're always reachable, always responding to someone, even if that someone is a work colleague or a social media notification, you're never fully present with the person who's right in front of you. And people feel that. They feel the quality of your attention, even when you think you're hiding it.
I went through a period where I decided to completely stop using my phone during mealtimes with people I care about. And the first thing I noticed was how much more I was noticing about the other people, their expressions, the details of what they were saying, the things they weren't saying. You recover a quality of attention that I think a lot of us have quietly lost.
That's something I want to try. Let's talk about friendship specifically, because I think it's one of the things that people let slip most easily as they get older, and it's also one of the things that people feel most sad about when they reflect on their lives.
Friendship in adulthood is genuinely hard to maintain. Not because people become less caring, but because life gets structured in ways that make it harder. When you're in school or university, you have built-in proximity and shared experience. You see the same people every day. Friendship forms almost automatically from that repeated contact.
And then you enter adult life and suddenly you have to engineer the conditions for friendship deliberately. You have to plan things in advance, coordinate busy schedules, travel to see people. And it's easy for that effort to feel like too much, especially when the week has already used up most of your energy.
The people who maintain strong friendships throughout their adult lives tend to be people who treat friendship as a genuine priority rather than something they'll get to when things slow down. And the hard truth is that things rarely slow down. You have to make the time deliberately, or the friendships quietly fade.
I have a friend I've known since we were 7 years old. And there have been periods of our lives where we've gone months without speaking. But when we do get together, we pick up exactly where we left off. And I think that's one of the great gifts of long-term friendship, the shared history, the sense of being known across time.
That's something that new friendships can't replicate, no matter how much warmth and chemistry is there. There's no substitute for simply having known someone for a very long time. Okay, so we've talked about identity, culture, relationships. Let's shift to something that takes up a huge proportion of most people's waking hours, which is work.
Work. The thing that can be the source of so much meaning and so much misery, often simultaneously. What's your take on how to think about work in a healthy way?
I've gone through a real evolution on this. I used to be someone who defined myself almost entirely through my work. My job was my identity. And there are advantages to that. You're motivated, you're committed, you bring real energy to what you do. But the disadvantage is that your sense of self becomes completely dependent on professional outcomes. If work goes badly, you don't just have a bad week, you feel that your worth as a person is in question.
That's such a common pattern, and I think it's particularly prevalent in cultures that strongly valorize productivity and professional achievement. The question I find useful is, What is work for? And the answer, I think, is that it serves several purposes: financial security, social connection, a sense of contribution, the experience of competence and mastery, and the mistake is treating any one of those as the whole point.
Yes. When people talk about loving their work, they often mean that their work provides all of those things. They're financially comfortable, they enjoy their colleagues, they feel they're contributing something meaningful, and they feel competent at what they do. But when any one of those elements is missing, it affects the whole equation.
And I think the idea of work as a calling, as the primary source of meaning in a person's life, is actually a relatively recent and culturally specific idea. For most of human history, work was what you did to survive. The meaning came from family, community, ritual, spiritual life. We've shifted enormous amounts of expectation onto work in ways that it often can't actually bear.
Which doesn't mean that meaningful work isn't possible or worth pursuing. But it does mean that we should probably diversify our sources of meaning rather than betting everything on professional fulfillment. The person who has a moderately satisfying job but rich friendships, creative pursuits, and a strong sense of community may actually be living a more meaningful life than the person who has a spectacular career but nothing much else.
That's a point I try to remind myself of regularly, because the pull of professional achievement is strong and can easily crowd out everything else if you let it. And I think especially in one's 30s and 40s, it becomes important to consciously invest in the non-work parts of life before they atrophy entirely.
Let's talk about technology now, because I think it's reshaping work in profound ways, as well as everything else. What's your honest assessment of where we are with technology and what it's doing to us?
Honestly? I think we're in the middle of a transformation that's as significant as the Industrial Revolution, and we don't fully understand it yet. Artificial intelligence is going to change, is already changing, which tasks require human labor, in ways that will affect almost every industry and profession. And unlike previous technological revolutions, this one is affecting not just physical labor but cognitive labor.
That's what makes it different, I think. Previous automation took over physical tasks that humans found exhausting or dangerous. This wave of technology is taking over tasks that we previously thought were distinctly human: writing, reasoning, creating, diagnosing. And that's forcing a fundamental question about what human contribution actually means.
And I don't think that question has a simple answer. One school of thought says that technology always creates more jobs than it destroys, and that humans will find new roles just as they always have. Another school of thought says this time is genuinely different, that the pace and breadth of AI capability means the transition will be much more disruptive than previous ones.
I find myself somewhere in the middle. I think human skills will remain essential: empathy, creativity, ethical judgment, the ability to build genuine relationships, to navigate ambiguity, but the premium on those skills will increase, while the demand for routine cognitive tasks decreases. Which means the people who invest in developing deeply human skills will be in a better position than those who don't.
And that has implications for education. If we're educating children primarily to perform tasks that machines will soon do better, we're not preparing them well for the world they're going to live in. The skills that will matter most: collaboration, communication, creativity, critical thinking, adaptability, are exactly the skills that traditional educational systems are often least good at developing.
Though I want to say something in defense of knowledge and expertise, because I think there's a risk of overcorrecting. The argument sometimes becomes, don't bother memorizing facts, just learn how to find information. Don't bother developing deep expertise in any one thing, just be a generalist who can adapt. And I think that misses something important. Deep expertise is still enormously valuable. Understanding the foundations of a field deeply is what allows you to ask the right questions and evaluate the answers you get.
Agreed. The danger of pure generalism is that you become someone who is comfortable with everything and excellent at nothing. And the danger of overspecialization is that you can't connect your expertise to the wider world. Probably what we want is what's sometimes called a T-shaped person: deep expertise in one or a few areas, combined with broad enough knowledge to connect and communicate across fields.
I've seen that combination be incredibly effective. People who know one thing very deeply and can also speak to people from completely different backgrounds are genuinely rare and genuinely valuable. Okay, we're covering a lot of ground here. Let me bring up something that I think we sometimes dance around but should talk about directly, which is mental health.
Yes. And I want to start by just acknowledging that the conversation around mental health has changed enormously in the last decade or so. There's far more openness now than there was, and I think that's genuinely good. When I was growing up, mental health wasn't something you discussed, certainly not in any direct way. If you were struggling, you just got on with it.
And a lot of suffering happened quietly as a result. People didn't seek help because seeking help felt like admitting weakness. And the stigma wasn't just external, a lot of it was internalized. People judged themselves harshly for struggling.
I have my own history with anxiety that I'm quite open about now, though I wasn't for a long time. And one of the things I found most helpful, when I eventually did start talking about it, was discovering how universal these experiences are. It can feel very isolating to struggle with mental health, because people's suffering tends to be invisible in a way that physical illness often isn't.
That's such an important point. When you break your leg, people can see it. They understand why you can't run or climb stairs. But when you're dealing with depression or anxiety, you often look perfectly fine from the outside, and the internal experience is invisible. Which can make it hard to explain, hard to justify to others, and hard to justify to yourself.
One thing that's helped me is understanding the difference between treating emotions as problems to be solved and treating them as information to be understood. Anxiety, for instance, is telling you something, usually that there's something in your environment or your life that feels threatening or uncertain. The question is whether the signal is accurate, whether the threat is real, and whether the response is proportionate.
That's a cognitive behavioral framing, essentially, the idea that it's not events themselves that cause distress, but our interpretations of them. And that by examining and questioning our interpretations, we can change our emotional responses.
Which works extremely well for certain things. But I also think there's value in the approaches that are less about changing thoughts and more about accepting them, the mindfulness tradition, for instance, which is less about thinking your way out of distress and more about learning to observe it with a degree of distance, without being swept away by it.
I found mindfulness genuinely helpful. Not as a practice of achieving blissful peace, because that's not really what meditation is about, despite what the apps sometimes suggest, but as a practice of learning to notice what's happening in your mind without immediately reacting to it. That tiny gap between stimulus and response is where a lot of freedom lives.
Viktor Frankl wrote beautifully about that gap. He said the last of human freedoms is the ability to choose one's response to any given set of circumstances. And while I think that can be overstated, because some circumstances genuinely overwhelm people's capacity to respond, there's something profound in the idea that we have more choice in how we engage with our experience than we often realize.
And that connects to what we were saying earlier about identity. Choosing how to respond, repeatedly, over time, is part of how you become who you are. Okay, let's take a lighter turn and talk about habits and health, because I think this is something a lot of people struggle with, not because they don't know what's good for them, but because knowing and doing are very different things.
This gap between knowledge and behavior is one of the most interesting and frustrating things in psychology. Almost everyone knows that regular exercise, good sleep, healthy eating, and moderate alcohol consumption are beneficial. But actually implementing these things consistently is something that eludes a large proportion of the population, including people who consider themselves reasonably intelligent and disciplined.
And I think part of the problem is willpower. We tend to think of behavior change as a matter of willpower. If you just want it badly enough, you'll do it. But willpower is actually a quite limited and unreliable resource. It depletes over the course of a day. It's heavily affected by stress, sleep deprivation, and blood sugar. Relying on willpower alone to maintain good habits is a strategy that fails most people most of the time.
Which is why the most sustainable approach to behavior change is not trying harder but designing your environment. If healthy food is the easiest food to reach and unhealthy food requires effort to obtain, you'll eat more healthily almost automatically. If your gym clothes are laid out the night before and your running shoes are by the door, the activation energy required to exercise is much lower.
James Clear writes about this in his book Atomic Habits, the idea that tiny changes in your environment can produce large changes in behavior over time, because you're working with the structure of human psychology rather than against it. You're removing friction from the behaviors you want to do more of, and adding friction to the ones you want to do less of.
And the compound nature of habits is something I find really motivating. Any individual habit seems small and its effects seem negligible in the short term. Going to bed 30 minutes earlier tonight will not transform your life tomorrow. But going to bed 30 minutes earlier every night for a year will transform your life. The effects compound.
Sleep specifically is something I feel quite passionate about, because I think it's dramatically undervalued in modern culture. We know so much now about what sleep does: the memory consolidation, the emotional processing, the physical repair, the clearance of metabolic waste from the brain, and yet chronic sleep deprivation is almost worn as a badge of honor in a lot of professional cultures.
It's absurd, really. If someone told you they were operating a complex machine while significantly impaired, you'd be concerned. But when people say they function on 5 hours of sleep, they often say it with a kind of pride. And the research is quite clear that 5 hours of sleep produces measurable cognitive impairment across almost every dimension: memory, attention, emotional regulation, decision-making, and that people who are sleep-deprived are poor judges of their own level of impairment.
Exercise is the other thing I want to mention because the evidence for its benefits is so comprehensive that it's almost miraculous. It's not just good for physical fitness. Regular exercise reduces anxiety and depression as effectively as medication in many cases. It improves cognitive function. It protects against cognitive decline in later life. It improves sleep. It enhances mood. It increases energy. There is almost no aspect of health, physical or mental, that is not improved by regular physical activity.
And yet most people don't do enough of it. And I think the key word is regular. Exercise doesn't need to be intense or lengthy to be effective. 30 minutes of moderate activity most days, brisk walking, cycling, swimming, is enough to produce very significant health benefits. The barrier isn't really lack of time. It's lack of habit. It hasn't become automatic yet.
And this goes back to what we were saying about environment design. People who exercise consistently have almost universally found a way to make it automatic: a fixed time, a social commitment, a routine that removes the daily decision about whether to do it. The decision fatigue of having to choose whether to exercise every day is what defeats a lot of people.
I want to pivot to something we haven't touched on yet, which is education. Because we've talked about habits and knowledge and skills, but the question of how people actually learn, and how we should be teaching people to learn, feels really central to a lot of what we've been discussing.
Education is one of those areas where I feel a kind of productive frustration. Because we know a tremendous amount now about how learning actually works, what the cognitive science says about memory, about attention, about the conditions that produce genuine understanding rather than surface familiarity, and so much of that knowledge is not reflected in how most schools actually operate.
What do you mean by that specifically?
Well, one example: we know from memory research that the way most students study is actually one of the least effective methods available. Reading and rereading your notes feels productive, it creates a sense of familiarity, but familiarity is not the same as retained understanding. The methods that actually produce durable learning are things like retrieval practice, actively trying to recall information without looking at your notes, and spaced repetition, which means studying something, letting time pass, and then returning to it before you've completely forgotten it.
The testing effect. I've read about this. The counterintuitive finding that taking practice tests is more effective for learning than spending the same time studying.
Exactly. And it's counterintuitive partly because testing feels harder than studying. When you try to recall something and you can't immediately remember it, it feels like failure. But that difficulty, that desirable difficulty, as researchers call it, is actually the signal that deep learning is happening. The struggle to remember is what strengthens the memory.
That has real implications for how we should design education. If we're teaching to the test in a way that rewards students for recognizing information they've seen before rather than genuinely recalling and applying it, we're actually undermining the kind of learning we claim to care about.
And there's the related issue of intrinsic motivation. We've talked about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation in the context of work, but it applies powerfully to education too. When children learn something because they're genuinely curious about it, because it matters to them, because it connects to something they care about, the learning is deeper, more durable, and more likely to transfer to new situations.
But so much of formal education is structured around extrinsic rewards and punishments, grades, rankings, the approval or disapproval of teachers and parents. And when you make external evaluation the primary driver, you tend to produce students who learn strategically, who optimize for the metric rather than for genuine understanding.
And worse, you can actually damage intrinsic motivation. There's a classic study where children who were already intrinsically motivated to draw were told they would receive a reward for drawing. After the reward was removed, they drew less than they had before the reward was introduced. The external reward had actually undermined the internal drive. It's called the overjustification effect.
So what does good education look like? If you could design it from scratch?
I think good education prioritizes genuine curiosity. It creates conditions for students to encounter ideas that genuinely fascinate them, and then gives them the tools and the time to pursue those ideas deeply. It develops metacognitive skills, the ability to understand how you learn, to monitor your own understanding, to ask good questions. And it develops the capacity to sit with complexity and uncertainty, rather than always requiring neat, clean answers.
I'd add something about the social dimension. One of the most important things about education is not the information transmitted but the habits of mind cultivated, and those habits are shaped by the quality of intellectual community you're part of. Being around people who think carefully, who ask interesting questions, who challenge your assumptions with respect, that shapes how you think in ways that are hard to quantify but very real.
Which is part of why I think education is about much more than skill acquisition or knowledge transfer. At its best, it's about formation, helping young people develop the values, the habits of mind, and the sense of self that will allow them to live well and contribute meaningfully to the world.
Let me ask you something related to all of this. What role do books play in your life? Because I know for me, reading has been one of the most formative influences, and I'm curious whether you feel the same way.
Books are central to how I think. I can trace so many of my most important ideas and values back to specific books that I read at specific moments in my life. There's a particular kind of encounter that books make possible, a sustained, deep engagement with another person's full thinking about something, that I don't get from any other medium.
What do you think is lost when people read less? Because the data suggests that deep reading, particularly of long-form prose, is declining, especially among young people.
I think several things are lost. First, the ability to sustain attention over a long period of time. Books require you to stay with something, to resist distraction, to return again and again to a train of thought that extends over dozens or hundreds of pages. That capacity for sustained attention is something that's under real pressure from the short-form, high-frequency stimulation of digital media.
And that sustained attention is a prerequisite for a lot of the most valuable intellectual work. You can't think deeply about a complex problem in 2-minute increments. Real understanding requires extended engagement with a problem.
Secondly, I think reading fiction specifically develops empathy in a very direct way. When you read a novel written from a perspective very different from your own, you're inhabiting another consciousness for hours or days. You see the world through their eyes, feel what they feel, understand their motivations from the inside. Research suggests this actually changes the way readers relate to real people who are different from them.
That's a striking finding. The idea that fiction is not just entertainment but a kind of social and moral training, it trains your capacity to understand and care about people unlike yourself.
And in a world that badly needs more of that capacity, finding time to read good fiction seems like it matters. Okay, let's talk about creativity, because it's something we touched on earlier but I want to go deeper on it.
creativity fascinates me partly because it seems so mysterious. You can't force it. You can't schedule a creative breakthrough for 3 o'clock Tuesday afternoon. And yet the evidence is that creativity is not entirely random, that certain conditions make it more likely to occur.
One of the most robust findings is that creativity tends to occur at the intersection of ideas from different domains. When knowledge from one field gets applied to problems in a very different field, that's often where genuine novelty emerges. Alexander Fleming's discovery of penicillin happened partly because he noticed something unexpected in his laboratory, a mold that seemed to be killing bacteria. He had the broad enough knowledge to recognize what he was seeing and the curiosity to pursue it.
And that suggests that the deepest creativity often requires both broad knowledge and deep expertise, knowing a lot about many things, and knowing at least one thing very deeply. The broad knowledge gives you raw material to combine. The deep expertise gives you the judgment to know which combinations are worth pursuing.
There's also a lot of evidence that incubation, stepping away from a problem after working on it intensely, produces more creative solutions than grinding through it continuously. The default mode network in the brain, which is active during rest and mind wandering, seems to be involved in making unexpected connections between distantly related concepts. Sleep, walks, showers, periods of unstructured time, these are not luxuries but part of the creative process.
Which is deeply inconvenient advice for people working in environments that equate busyness with productivity. The idea that you should take a nap or go for a long walk when you're stuck on a problem is not something most workplaces encourage.
No, it isn't. But the science is quite clear. And I think one of the practical implications for creative workers is to be more intentional about protecting time for incubation, for letting the unconscious mind do its work, rather than scheduling every hour with meetings and tasks.
What about the role of constraints in creativity? Because I've often found that having limited resources or a very specific brief produces more creative work than having unlimited freedom.
That's a very well-documented phenomenon. When you have infinite options, decision paralysis often sets in, and you default to safe, conventional choices because there's no reason to take creative risks. But when constraints force you to find solutions that work within specific limits, you're pushed to think in ways you wouldn't have otherwise. The constraint becomes a generative force.
There are wonderful examples of this in art. Dr. Seuss wrote Green Eggs and Ham using only 50 different words, because his editor challenged him to write a book using fewer words than his previous book. The constraint produced one of the most beloved children's books ever written. Shakespeare worked within the strict formal requirements of the sonnet, 14 lines in iambic pentameter with a specific rhyme scheme, and the constraint seemed to produce rather than inhibit his poetry.
And in everyday creative work, giving yourself constraints, a deadline, a word limit, a specific format, a rule that you can only use certain materials, can break the paralysis of unlimited possibility and force the kind of creative problem-solving that produces interesting results.
I want to talk about something that I think connects a lot of what we've been discussing, which is the idea of community. Because we've talked about relationships at the individual level, but there's also something important at the level of the group, the neighborhood, the town, the institution, the cultural community.
Community is something I think about a lot. And I think there's been a real erosion of community in many places over the past few decades, not because people care less about connection, but because the structures that used to generate community automatically have weakened. Religious institutions, local civic organizations, neighborhood associations, the culture of knowing your neighbors, these things provided ready-made community for previous generations.
And what has replaced them? For a lot of people, work has become a kind of surrogate community. Or online communities of interest. Neither of which is a perfect substitute.
Work can be great community when it works, but it has inherent limitations. Your work community is not chosen freely, you're thrown together with whoever happens to work at the same company. The relationships are shaped by power dynamics and financial interest in ways that pure friendship isn't. And when the job ends, the community often evaporates.
Online communities are interesting. They're genuinely valuable for people who feel marginalized or alone in their physical location, who don't have anyone nearby who shares their specific interest or identity. But they also tend to lack the full texture of in-person community, the shared physical space, the practical interdependence, the full complexity of real human beings who aren't just the most carefully curated version of themselves.
I think the communities that seem to produce the most genuine belonging are ones that are built around a shared practice or purpose rather than just a shared identity. A community of people who all make pottery together, or grow food together, or sing in a choir together, or play sport together. The shared activity creates real bonds in a way that just agreeing about things doesn't.
That's a really important distinction. The doing together, the experiencing together, is what creates genuine connection. Shared belief alone is not enough. You need shared life, shared meals, shared effort, shared difficulty.
And I think there's something here about the importance of difference within community. The most resilient communities I've encountered are ones where people are different from each other in important ways but share enough common ground, a shared neighborhood, a shared practice, a shared commitment to something, to stay in real relationship across their differences. That's much harder than being in community with people who are just like you, but I think it's more valuable.
Let's talk about something that doesn't get discussed enough in the context of the good life, which is aging. Because for all the emphasis on youth and novelty in modern culture, the evidence from psychology and from people's own accounts is that later life often brings surprising gifts.
That is so true, and so counter to the cultural narrative. There's a finding in psychology called the paradox of aging, or sometimes the U-curve of happiness, the observation that subjective well-being tends to follow a U-shaped curve across the lifespan. It's relatively high in youth, dips in middle age, and then rises again in later life, often reaching its highest levels in the 60s and 70s.
Which sounds implausible until you look at the reasons. Older people tend to be better at emotional regulation, they've had more practice, they've developed strategies, they're less reactive to things that don't ultimately matter. They tend to have a clearer sense of what they value and to invest their time and energy more deliberately. And they tend to have lower rates of social comparison. They're less preoccupied with how they stack up against others.
There's also a fascinating shift in time perspective. The psychologist Laura Carstensen has studied how people's goals and priorities change as they age, and one of her key findings is that when people perceive time as limited, as older people naturally do, they tend to focus on what's emotionally meaningful rather than what's instrumentally useful. They prioritize relationships. They spend time on things that matter to them rather than things that might pay off eventually.
And there's a lesson there for people of any age. The exercise of imagining that your time is more limited than you think it is, what would you do differently? What would you stop doing? What would you finally make time for? Tends to produce a clarifying shift in priorities.
It's similar to the practice of imagining your future self and what they would think of the choices you're making now. Your 80-year-old self looking back, will they be glad you worked late on that particular Tuesday, or will they wish you had been at the school play?
I want to take us in a slightly different direction and talk about money. Because I think money is one of those topics that people are strangely reluctant to discuss honestly, even though it has an enormous effect on people's lives and well-being.
You're right that there's a strange taboo around it. People will discuss their health, their relationships, their fears, their failures, before they'll discuss their finances in any real detail. And I think that taboo keeps a lot of people in the dark about things that would genuinely help them.
What do you think the research actually tells us about the relationship between money and happiness? Because I feel like this is an area where the popular understanding has shifted a lot in recent years.
The famous early finding was that beyond a certain income level, a point at which your basic needs and modest comforts are reliably met, additional money doesn't make you happier. The research by Kahneman and Deaton that's often cited found a plateau around $75,000 a year in the United States at the time of their study.
But more recent research has pushed back on that, hasn't it?
It has. There's a 2021 study by Matthew Killingsworth that found well-being continues to rise with income even beyond that plateau, at least for some people. The picture seems to be more nuanced than the simple story that money stops mattering after a certain point. What seems to matter is not just how much you have but how you spend it, and whether the way you earn it aligns with your values and allows you to live the kind of life you want.
That's interesting. Because there's really good evidence that spending money on experiences produces more lasting happiness than spending it on things. And that spending money on other people, giving it away, treating friends, charitable giving, tends to produce more happiness than spending it on yourself.
Both of those findings have been replicated quite robustly. The experience advantage, the fact that holidays and concerts and good meals with friends produce more lasting well-being than cars and clothes and gadgets, is partly because experiences become part of your identity and your story in a way that possessions don't. And the social spending advantage seems to activate reward systems in the brain in a way that self-directed spending often doesn't.
Financial security matters enormously, though. And I think it's important not to romanticize the idea that money doesn't matter. For people who are genuinely struggling, who are anxious about paying rent or feeding their children, money buys the psychological freedom from that anxiety, and that freedom is genuinely life-changing.
Absolutely. The worst effects of poverty are not just material. The cognitive load of financial anxiety, the constant background stress of not knowing how you'll manage, is exhausting and depletes the mental resources available for everything else. Research by Sendel Molinathan and Eldar Shaffer found that the mental burden of scarcity literally reduces measured IQ scores, not because poor people are less intelligent, but because scarcity hijacks cognitive bandwidth.
That's such an important finding for how we think about inequality and why simplistic narratives about people lifting themselves up by their bootstraps are so inadequate. The cognitive tax of poverty makes it much harder to make good long-term decisions precisely when good long-term decisions matter most.
And it connects to what we were saying earlier about designing environments. If we want people to make better financial decisions, the answer is not primarily to educate them better, though that helps, but to design the default options so that good choices are automatic. Automatic enrollment in pension schemes, for instance, has increased retirement savings rates enormously, not because people's preferences changed but because the path of least resistance changed.
Let me ask about something that I think ties together a lot of what we've been discussing, which is the question of how we find meaning. Because we've touched on it in the context of work and relationships, but I'd like to hear your fuller thinking on it.
Meaning is a fascinating concept. The philosopher Susan Wolf argues that meaning arises at the intersection of active engagement and objective worth, that you find meaning when you're actively involved in something that is genuinely valuable, not just pleasurable or entertaining. A life spent doing things that feel good in the moment but have no impact beyond yourself may be pleasant, but it lacks meaning in this deeper sense.
And yet I think meaning is also highly personal. What provides meaning for one person may feel empty or pointless to another. Does that make it subjective?
I think there's both a subjective and an objective dimension. The subjective dimension is that you have to feel the engagement, you can't generate meaning through duty alone, through doing things that are valuable but leave you cold. But the objective dimension is that the engagement has to be with something that genuinely matters beyond your own preferences and feelings. Obsessively collecting stamps may engage you deeply but probably doesn't qualify as meaningful in the fullest sense.
Though I'm cautious about being too prescriptive about what counts as genuinely worthwhile. Who decides?
Fair challenge. I think the test is something like, does this contribute something to the world or to other people, even indirectly? Does it connect you to something larger than yourself? The stamp collector who connects with a community, who shares knowledge and history with others, who contributes to the preservation of something culturally significant, is doing something quite different from the one who hoards stamps in isolation.
Connection to something larger than yourself seems to be a recurring theme across almost everything we've discussed. In relationships, in community, in work, in creativity, the experiences that feel most significant are usually ones that transcend the purely personal.
I think that's right. And it connects to why practices like religion and spirituality have been so central to human life for so long. They provide exactly that, a framework of meaning that situates your individual life within a much larger story, connects you to a community, and provides rituals and practices that embody that connection.
Even for people who don't hold religious beliefs, and I'm one of them, I think there's something important to learn from the wisdom traditions about how to live. About the importance of reflection, of gratitude, of acknowledging limitation, of community practice.
Alain de Botton has written about this, the idea that secular people can learn from the architecture of religion without adopting its metaphysics. The practice of regularly pausing to reflect on what matters. Of taking time to acknowledge beauty and gratitude. Of belonging to communities that are not just instrumental. These things don't require supernatural belief.
Something that's related to all of this, the question of how to handle failure. Because I think one of the things that separates people who live well from people who are stuck is not the absence of failure but the relationship to it.
Failure is something I feel strongly about. Not because I enjoy it, I don't, but because I've come to think that my most significant growth has come from things that went wrong rather than things that went right. When something works, you often don't learn very much, because you don't need to examine it carefully. When something fails, you're forced to understand why.
There's research on this, isn't there? That people actually learn more from failure than success, under the right conditions.
Under the right conditions is the key phrase. The conditions that make failure useful are that you examine it carefully, draw specific lessons, and have the psychological safety to be honest about what went wrong. The conditions that make failure destructive are when it leads to shame and self-condemnation that prevent honest examination, or when there are no consequences that make the learning feel urgent.
And cultural context matters hugely here. In some cultures, Silicon Valley being the extreme example, failure is almost valorized, treated as evidence of bold risk-taking and a necessary step on the road to eventual success. In other cultures, failure is deeply shameful and people go to great lengths to conceal it.
Both extremes have problems. The failure celebration culture can become dishonest, treating every failure as a learning experience regardless of whether lessons were actually drawn, and it can be used to justify recklessness. The failure shame culture prevents people from taking necessary risks and from being honest about what went wrong.
The healthy relationship with failure seems to involve taking it seriously without taking it personally. Understanding that failure reveals information about what you tried, not about your fundamental worth as a person.
And having people around you who can hold that perspective when you lose it yourself. Because in the moment of failure, it's very hard to maintain that distance. That's when the quality of your relationships becomes particularly important, people who can help you process what happened without either dismissing it or catastrophizing it.
Let's talk about something that I know you care deeply about, which is nature and the natural world. Because we've been talking a lot about human relationships and human society, but there's something important about the relationship between people and the larger living world.
Yes. And I find that this is a topic that people often treat as separate from questions about human well-being, as though the natural world is important for its own sake but not necessarily connected to how well people live. Whereas I think the connection is profound and reciprocal.
The research on this has grown considerably over the past decade or so. The evidence that time in natural environments reduces stress, lowers blood pressure, improves mood and cognitive function, that's now quite well established.
What I find particularly interesting is research showing that the benefit isn't primarily about exercise or fresh air, though those matter. Even simply being able to see trees and green spaces from a window produces measurable health benefits. There's something specifically restorative about natural environments, about fractal patterns, about the sounds of water and birds, about the qualities of natural light, that seems to be deeply embedded in human neurology, probably as a result of spending most of our evolutionary history in natural settings.
And the corollary, which is that the degree of disconnection from nature that characterizes modern urban life has real costs. Not just environmental costs, but costs to human well-being. The epidemic of attention disorders, the extraordinary rates of anxiety and depression, the chronic stress, these things have multiple causes, but I think the impoverishment of our relationship to the natural world is one underappreciated factor.
The Japanese practice of Shinrin-yoku that we've probably both read about, forest bathing, literally just spending slow, mindful time among trees, has been shown to produce quite dramatic reductions in cortisol, the stress hormone. And there are now doctors in Japan who prescribe time in nature as a genuine health intervention.
Which should sound strange, the idea that simply spending time in a forest is a medical treatment, but the evidence increasingly suggests it's not strange at all. It's just that we've lost touch with something that humans have always known, which is that being in living natural environments is restorative in ways that being in built environments is not.
And of course there's the larger question of what our relationship to the natural world should be in the face of the ecological crisis. But I think even setting that aside, even just from a purely self-interested perspective, cultivating a richer relationship with nature is good for people. Being outside more, being more attentive to the non-human world, developing the capacity to notice and appreciate the living systems around us, these things are good for us regardless of their environmental implications.
Though I think once you develop that relationship, once you genuinely care about the living world around you, the environmental implications become impossible to ignore. You can't fall in love with a forest or an ocean and then be indifferent to what's happening to them.
That's beautifully put. And maybe that's one of the most important things we can do, not to argue people into caring about the natural world through abstract information about climate change and biodiversity loss, though that matters too, but to create conditions for people to actually experience it. To fall in love with specific places, specific rivers, specific trees. That emotional connection is probably more motivating than any amount of data.
I want to spend some time on something we've circled around without addressing directly, which is happiness. Because everything we've been discussing is in some way connected to the question of what makes a good life, and happiness is the concept most often invoked in that context.
It's a concept with a lot of baggage, though. The word happiness in English tends to suggest a kind of permanent pleasant emotional state, which is not really what the research points toward as the goal of a good life. The ancient Greek concept of eudaimonia is often translated as happiness, but it really means something more like flourishing, living in accordance with your deepest capacities and values, contributing to something beyond yourself, developing genuine excellence in things that matter.
And that's a much richer and more demanding concept than feeling good all the time. It includes things like meaningful challenge, like contributing to others, like developing your capacities, all of which can involve significant discomfort.
The research distinguishes between what's sometimes called hedonic well-being, pleasure, positive emotion, the absence of pain, and eudaimonic well-being, meaning, engagement, growth. And while they're correlated, they're not the same thing, and the things that maximize each can actually be in tension.
A classic example would be parenting. Having children is one of the life choices most strongly associated with a sense of meaning and purpose. But it's also associated with reduced hedonic happiness in the daily experience sense, more stress, less sleep, less freedom, more anxiety. People who have children are not, on average, in a better moment-to-moment mood than those who don't.
But they do tend to report higher levels of meaning and purpose. And in retrospect, the overwhelming majority say that having children is among the most important and fulfilling things they've done, even given the difficulty. Which suggests that when people evaluate their lives overall, they're not just summing up pleasant versus unpleasant moments, they're assessing whether their lives have been about something worthwhile.
Daniel Kahneman distinguished between the experiencing self and the remembering self. The experiencing self lives in the present moment, it can tell you whether this moment is pleasant or not. The remembering self constructs your life narrative, it evaluates how things went overall. And these two selves often disagree, because the remembering self is not an accurate record of the experiencing self's moment-to-moment states. It's subject to what Kahneman calls the peak end rule, it weights intense moments and final moments disproportionately.
So a holiday that had wonderful peak moments and ended well will be remembered as better than one that was pleasant throughout but ended poorly, even if the total amount of pleasant experience was greater in the second case. And this has interesting implications for how we think about designing experiences, and also for how we think about life decisions.
The peak end rule explains why we sometimes make decisions that our future selves will be glad of even though they make our present self uncomfortable. Difficult experiences that end well, or that contain peak moments of connection or achievement, tend to be remembered as positive and meaningful, even when the immediate experience was mixed.
And that connects back to the idea of meaningful challenge. Experiences that involve real difficulty but lead to genuine accomplishment are the ones that get written into our life stories as the important chapters. The easy, comfortable chapters rarely are.
What about the concept of flow that Csikszentmihalyi wrote about? Because that seems to be a state that bridges the hedonic and eudaimonic dimensions, it's deeply pleasurable in the moment and also involves full engagement and genuine challenge.
Flow is one of the most compelling ideas in positive psychology. The state of complete absorption in a challenging but manageable activity, where time seems to disappear, self-consciousness fades, and you're fully present in what you're doing, seems to be one of the most reliably positive experiences that human beings can have.
And Csikszentmihalyi found that flow could occur in almost any activity, not just stereotypically engaging ones like sports or art, but even in work that others might consider mundane, if the person doing it was fully absorbed and appropriately challenged. The key conditions are that the challenge of the activity slightly exceeds your current skill level, enough to engage you fully, but not so much that you become anxious.
That's why the flow zone is sometimes described as the sweet spot between boredom and anxiety. Too easy and you're bored. Too hard and you're overwhelmed. Just right and you're in flow. And this has real implications for how to think about learning and skill development. You want to be consistently working at the edge of your current capabilities, not resting in your comfort zone.
Though the comfort zone has its place too. Rest, consolidation, the pleasure of doing things you're already good at, these are part of the picture. The skill is in knowing when to push and when to restore.
I think travel is worth mentioning in this context, because it's one of the experiences people most associate with meaning and positive memory, even when it's uncomfortable or challenging in the moment.
Travel is a fascinating case. People will describe a trip as wonderful and one of the best experiences of their lives while also remembering that they were exhausted and lost and frustrated for much of it. The discomfort gets edited out in memory while the peak moments and the sense of discovery remain.
And I think travel works on something deep in us precisely because it does involve genuine discomfort and genuine discovery in combination. You're forced to be adaptable, to navigate the unfamiliar, to rely on strangers, to let go of control. And from that challenge comes a kind of aliveness, a heightened engagement with the present moment, that's hard to achieve in the comfortable routines of home.
The novelist Alain de Botton wrote beautifully about the gap between anticipation and reality in travel, the way we imagine a destination will transform us, and then discover that we've brought ourselves with us. Our habitual worries and distractions travel with us. But I think he also acknowledged that travel can genuinely shift perspective in lasting ways, even if it doesn't deliver the transformation we imagined.
Particularly if you travel slowly and with genuine curiosity rather than efficiently ticking off destinations. The traveler who spends 2 weeks in one place, who shops at local markets and takes the local bus and has conversations with people who live there, is having a very different experience from the one who rushes between sites.
And there's a strong ethical dimension to this too, as you mentioned. How to travel in ways that contribute to the places you visit rather than extracting from them. Staying in locally owned accommodation, eating at local restaurants, being curious about local culture and history rather than just the photogenic surfaces.
Which comes back to what we were saying about attention. The quality of attention you bring to a place, or to anything, really, determines the quality of what you get from it. A tourist and a traveler can visit the same destination and have completely different experiences, because they're attending to completely different things.
Okay, I really think we should start wrapping up now. This has been the most wonderful conversation, but our listeners have been with us for a long time and they deserve a proper close.
You're right. Though before we close, I want to say something about language learning specifically, since that's why everyone is here. I think there's a misconception that language learning is primarily about accumulating vocabulary and internalizing grammar rules. And while those things matter, I think the deeper thing that language learning develops is listening itself. The capacity to really hear, to attend to nuance, to follow complex arguments across time, to pick up meaning from tone and rhythm as well as words.
And that capacity, real listening, is one of the most valuable things a human being can develop. In every conversation we've had today, the moments of most genuine connection and insight came from listening carefully to each other rather than from whatever clever thing we said in response.
There's a reason we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. I know that sounds like a cliché, but the principle behind it isn't. Genuinely hearing someone, really attending to what they're saying rather than forming your response while they're still speaking, is a gift that most people are given far too rarely, and is something that makes whoever you're with feel genuinely seen and valued.
There's one more area I want to touch on before we close, and that's kindness. Because I think it's one of those qualities that gets talked about in a slightly saccharine way, as though it's simply a nice-to-have personality trait. But I actually think it's one of the most important and underrated forces in human life.
I agree completely. And the research on kindness and prosocial behavior is one of the most consistently hopeful bodies of evidence in psychology. Being kind to others reliably increases the well-being of the person doing the kindness, not just the recipient. It activates the same neural reward pathways as receiving something pleasurable. And its effects seem to last longer than most hedonic pleasures.
There's a concept called the helper's high that describes the positive emotional state that follows acts of generosity or kindness. And this isn't just a subjective report, you can measure it physiologically. The stress hormones go down, the mood improves, the immune markers shift in a positive direction.
And there's evidence that witnessing kindness, seeing someone else be generous or compassionate, produces a similar effect, which is sometimes called elevation. You see someone do something kind and you feel a kind of warmth and expansion in your chest. You feel more inclined to be kind yourself. Kindness is contagious in the most literal neurological sense.
That makes me think about the importance of how we pay attention to the world around us. If you look for evidence that people are selfish and untrustworthy, you'll find it easily. If you look for evidence that people are kind and generous, you'll find that too. And the evidence suggests that focusing on and noticing kindness actually increases it, both in your own behavior and in your perception of others.
There's also something important about the relationship between kindness and courage. Genuine kindness often requires courage. Standing up for someone who's being treated unfairly. Telling someone a hard truth because you care about their long-term well-being more than their short-term comfort. Forgiving someone who has hurt you. These are not soft things. They require real strength.
And I think there's a misconception that kindness and firmness are opposites, that being kind means being accommodating, avoiding conflict, never saying no. Whereas genuinely kind people are often very direct and very honest, precisely because they care enough to tell the truth rather than telling people what they want to hear.
Compassionate honesty is what I try to aim for. Not brutal honesty, which sometimes is just brutality wearing the costume of honesty. Not comfortable dishonesty, which avoids difficulty at the cost of genuine connection. But kindness that includes the willingness to be truthful even when it's difficult.
And I think that connects back to everything we've talked about today. Identity, relationships, culture, work, creativity, learning, nature, meaning, all of these are shaped by the quality of attention and care we bring to them. The common thread through all of it is the question of how to be genuinely present and genuinely engaged with the life we're living and the people we're sharing it with.
That's beautifully said, James. And I think it's a thread worth holding on to. Not because getting it right is easy, it isn't, and we've talked today about how many things pull against it. But because the alternative, moving through life distracted and disconnected, is a real loss. Not a dramatic, obvious loss, but a quiet one. The accumulated cost of attention not paid, connections not made, moments not inhabited.
One thing I found helpful is the practice of regularly asking myself a very simple question: am I here? Not in a philosophical sense, but a practical one. Is my attention on what's actually in front of me right now? Because so much of the suffering that people experience comes not from their actual circumstances but from being mentally somewhere other than where they physically are, replaying the past, rehearsing the future, consuming content from other people's lives instead of inhabiting their own.
That practice of noticing, am I here? Is deceptively simple and genuinely transformative if you apply it consistently. Not because the present moment is always comfortable or enjoyable. It often isn't. But because it's real in a way that the mind's distractions are not. And there's something in human beings that responds very deeply to reality, to actually being present with what is, rather than with what might be or was or could be.
We should probably start thinking about wrapping up, but I want to ask you one last question. What's something you've changed your mind about recently? Something you used to believe quite firmly and now think differently about?
That's a great question. I used to be quite firm in the view that knowing something intellectually was sufficient, that if you understood something rationally, that was enough for it to actually change your behavior. And I've come to think that's quite wrong. We can know things intellectually and still not have that knowledge reach us at the level where it actually influences how we live. Embodied experience, practice, repetition, ritual, emotion, is often necessary to close the gap between knowing and being.
That's a profound shift. What led to it?
Honestly, noticing the gap in my own life. Knowing that certain things were important and still not doing them. Knowing that certain relationships needed attention and still neglecting them. Knowing that rest mattered and still not resting. It forced me to acknowledge that knowledge without practice is incomplete.
I've changed my mind about the value of tradition. I used to be quite dismissive of traditions and rituals. They seemed arbitrary, tied to historical circumstances that no longer apply. And I've come to think that many traditions encode wisdom that's not always articulable in rational terms. The ritual itself, the repeated performance of something in a particular way at a particular time, does something that intellectual understanding alone cannot. It creates continuity, shared identity, and a kind of embodied meaning.
That's a meaningful shift. And it's connected to what I was just saying about embodiment. The knowing isn't just in the head. It's in the practices, the rituals, the habits of the body and the community.
Let's talk about the future. Because I think we've been covering a lot of ground about the present and the past, but I'm genuinely curious about where you see things going, and what kind of future you're hoping for.
That's a big question. Let me start with what I'm genuinely optimistic about, because I don't think optimism comes naturally to me, I have to work at it. And one thing I feel genuinely optimistic about is human creativity and adaptability. Every generation has faced challenges that seemed insuperable, and most of them have found ways through. The problems we face now are real and serious, but they're not beyond human ingenuity.
I share that optimism, though I think it has to be paired with a clear-eyed view of the work that needs to happen. Climate change, for instance, is a problem that is well within human technical capability to address. The technology for renewable energy exists. The economics are increasingly in its favor. What's needed is the political and social will to make the transition quickly enough.
And I think the generation that's in their 20s now, the generation that's grown up with the reality of climate change as an undeniable fact rather than a future concern, has a different relationship to this issue than previous generations. There's a clarity and urgency there that I find genuinely inspiring, even as I'm also aware of how much they're bearing.
What about technology? We've talked about AI in the context of work, but do you have a sense of the broader shape of things?
Honestly, I find it hard to predict. The pace of development in AI is faster than most people's intuitions can keep up with. What I can say is that the questions it raises, about what it means to be human, about the nature of intelligence and creativity, about how we distribute the benefits and risks of powerful technology, are questions that will define the coming decades.
And they're questions that require input from people with many different kinds of expertise and perspective, not just technologists, but philosophers, psychologists, sociologists, artists, ethicists. I think one of the risks is that the people building these systems become too insulated from the broader human consequences of what they're creating.
That's a risk I think about a lot. The concentration of enormous technological power in a relatively small number of companies and individuals is something that should be making more people uneasy than it seems to. Not because the people involved are malicious, but because no small group of people, however intelligent and well-intentioned, should have that much influence over how the technology that shapes everyone's life develops.
There's a broader question underneath that, which is about the kind of future we actually want. And I think that's a question that doesn't get discussed enough in public life. We have a lot of conversation about technological possibility, what can we do, and much less about what kind of world we're trying to build.
I want to live in a world where people have the material security to develop their full potential. Where access to education, healthcare, and opportunity is not dependent on accident of birth. Where the diversity of human experience and culture is genuinely valued rather than steamrolled into uniformity. Where we live in something like a sustainable relationship with the natural world. Those are my hopes. They're not particularly original, but I think they matter.
I share all of those. And I'd add something about the quality of public life, the way we talk to each other across difference. Because I think one of the things that worries me most about the current moment is the erosion of the idea that it's possible to have genuine, respectful disagreement. The polarization of public discourse, the tendency to see political and social questions as battles to be won rather than problems to be solved, feels very corrosive to me.
That's something I feel strongly about too. Because I've had conversations with people across a very wide range of perspectives, and I've almost always found something valuable and something I could learn. Not because every view is equally valid, some views are clearly wrong, but because most people's views are rooted in genuine experience and genuine concern, and understanding where they're coming from is a prerequisite for actually influencing anything.
And that requires the hard work of actually listening. Which, again, is something that social media and the attention economy are not exactly designed to encourage. The incentive structure of most digital platforms rewards outrage, certainty, and tribe loyalty. It punishes nuance, uncertainty, and genuine engagement with opposing views.
Which is one of the reasons I think the conversations we have offline, the face-to-face ones, the long ones, the uncomfortable ones, matter more than ever. They're one of the things that hasn't been captured and monetized and optimized for engagement. They still belong to us.
I love that framing. Conversation as something that still belongs to us. That's a hopeful note to end on, I think. Before we wrap up, is there anything you want to say to the people listening?
Yes, actually. I want to say that if you've listened this far, and this has been a long conversation, your attention and persistence are something to be genuinely proud of. Listening in a second or third language is hard. Sustaining attention for a long period is hard. The fact that you're doing it is evidence of a quality that will serve you well in every area of your life.
That's beautifully said. I'd add that the world needs people who can listen carefully, think clearly, and communicate across difference. If you're developing those skills, and that's exactly what deep listening practice builds, you're developing something genuinely valuable, not just for your English, but for your life.
See you next week, everyone. And thank you, James. This was a wonderful conversation.
The pleasure was entirely mine, Emma. See you all next week.